Testing one, two, three.
I hear you.
All righty. Hi. Gonna begin now.
Okay.
Welcome. All righty then. Yes, we are live streaming. Welcome to Wednesday office hours. We're going to look a little bit more today at quantum political economy, but from a different point of view. Um, well, not so much a different point of view. We're just starting foundationally again, but I came across another introduction to quantum approaches to financialization that is more, to me, more concise and more interesting. And this is from the Bureau of International Settlements, which is the mechanism by which we, you know, uh, do currency exchanges and at the massive, global currency exchanges. It's like exchanging one type of currency for another and trying to level it all out and doing it, efficiently. So this is a paper done by some folks there on quantum political economy. It's a 2024 piece. Um, Useful, but particularly if you're interested in financial stuff. It's got a lot of extra stuff that we're not going to cover, but I'll go through that, among other things. And because I believe we should sort of triangulate on the topic and as well not get too tied up in the quantum aspect of it, because actually this particular piece from the BIS is useful because it identifies the limitations of the math. That is, that certain things work really well with quantum processes, whereas a lot of things, and I think we intuitively knew that anyway, and most people talk about it sort of in that way, that it's not going to displace so-called classical computing. It's just that classical computing does one thing and quantum does something that is at some moment is like it, but there are things that are better adapted to be done by quantum computing that might not act, that that classical computing does not do. So there's certain advantages in particular areas because of, I would assert, the degree of abstraction and the degree of sort of the econophysics analogy, if you want to get too technical. That is that it operates, it's got physical laws, and of course quantum physics is, you know, different, and that difference has the possibility of being interesting to economists, but only certain things and certain types of economies. And who knows? I mean, in a decade, it'll probably be different. But at the present moment, and the advantage, of course, is that, as far as I understand, it's possible to get free computing time on quantum computers. So at least for now, and that would be very interesting to test, algorithms on, so you don't have to pay or try to finagle, as happened in prior years, quote unquote, time on the supercomputer, which is uh, some people's problems anyway with computing. So I begin our little talk with a quotation, couple of quotations. So, according to Marx, there's sort of a crisis, which may be produced by itself as an independent phenomenon in such a way as to react only indirectly on industry and commerce. The pivot of these crises is to be found in moneyed capital, and their sphere of direct action is therefore the sphere of that capital vis-a-vis banking, the stock exchange, and finance. This is that whole business about, well, Marx didn't have a theory of financialization, blah, 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 blah. It's there. You just have to go hunt it down in, mainly volumes 2 and 3. Well, I think that's actually maybe a quote from volume 1. But anyway, needless to say, it's there. And so there's another quote that I want to begin with. It's an article by Patty Quick. Um, and I think it states in a very short way why we do what we do. So this is a quote from Hodgkin, a political economist from the early 19th century. Men had better be without education, that be educated by their rulers. For then, education is but the mere breaking in of the steer to the yoke, the mere discipline of the hunting dog, which, by dint of severity, is made to forego the strongest impulse of his nature, and instead of devouring his prey, to bring it to the feet of his master, which is, pretty intuitive if you've, dealt with uh, game hunting, wing shooting. Anyway, so Patty Quick's article is "Capitalism, like all class societies, constitutes a system of armed robbery." That's kind of the front end of this. It is armed robbery. The robbery consists of the expropriation by the non-laboring ruling class. This is, an old argument, right, about paid and unpaid labor, of a portion of the household and wage labor production of the women, men, and children of the laboring class. This requires, well, this is the important point, use of force, hence armed robbery, carried out in all class societies by a state which is under the control of the ruling class. This is feudal as well. Note that this idea of force stuff goes back much further, obviously. It takes place both nationally and internationally in the forms of both actual and threatened police violence, mass incarceration, and of course, war. Radical political economics, because that's what Patty Quick is talking about here, recognizes the unjust division of income, but sees capitalism as rooted in wealth, more specifically, the private ownership by capitalists of an overwhelming and growing proportion of society's means of production. This is nothing new if you've read enough of this stuff, but the continual existence of unemployment and its associated poverty constitutes the prerequisite for the payment of wages that are barely sufficient for the maintenance and generational reproduction of the working class. Also, capitalism is a system of capital accumulation, ever expanding production that has no end goal other than the continuation of that problem. Also, capitalism requires the development and propagation of a system of ideas, an ideology, that is a system of beliefs, that portrays this armed robbery as not only just, but inevitable. And you can apply this to all kinds of stuff. People, on the one hand, you can use it to rationalize actual armed robbery in a revolutionary context, but just, our social contracts as a political economy. So I thought I'd begin with that just because, she does a good job of just sort of, that's kind of why we do what we do. So at the end, as I normally do, I have stuff I want to talk about that is plopped at the end of the document, partially to get you to read the whole document, but also because they're just sort of peripheral areas that we might come back to. So this one article, which is not as good as I expected, but it does claim to be a modern Marxist monetary theory, or an MMT, that is a 3M M cubed T. And it raises some useful questions, but it not that it's going to do it, and particularly the way this person does it. Firstly, how can token money, that is money without any intrinsic value, right? It's not gold coins, circulate valuable commodities? And secondly, why do prices not fall in line with the cheapening of production in terms of labor time when circulated by the symbolic money? So this is a continual problem and raises all the usual questions about the difference between industrial capital, merchant capital, financial capital. And so, without getting too far down into the weeds about this, because he does actually use the usual algebra, this raises some other useful questions about money that comes in a prior article, which is the introduction. And I've read this before, but to suggest that you might look at it again. And that is the 2005 book, on Marx's theory of money. And this is the introduction to it. It's really a good collection because it does combine and mostly does a really great job to kind of collect all those things that, to give a précis of it in the introduction. And I'm not going to read it all, but he does cover some of the things that we're going to talk about today, and that is Kurt Rutten, Money as Constituent of Value, focuses on Marx's theory of money in Chapter 3 of Volume 1 of Capital, in relation to the theory of value in Chapter 1. Rutten's argument, or Reuten's argument, implies that the orthodox interpretation of Marx's theory of money presented above is a misinterpretation. And Rutten presents an alternative. This is where we kind of currently are in some areas of Marxism, is value form interpretation of Marx's theory. For Marx, Rutten argues, the ideal, immanent, and that's an important word we'll come back to, Hegel, etc., or in introversive substance of the value of commodities is, quote unquote, abstract labor. Now, and let me stop for a second and break for a second and say, we've been talking about this a lot, about how abstract is abstract labor, and, do we use it as a kind of proxy as opposed to actual, labor, lived labor in that sense, as opposed to labor power. It's already abstracted in Marx's mind. So, we're not making it more abstract necessarily. We're just fleshing out the differences among abstract representations. That's a very crude way of putting it. However, back to the text. This is a notion at a high level abstraction, as I just said. It does not provide a measure in the usual sense of measuring, and that's kind of the whole business and kind of why we're looking at quantum stuff. We can measure time of heterogeneous concrete labor. That's right. You pick something up and you hammer something or whatever. But this is not what Marx is getting at. The notion of value, thus posited, is what Rutten calls the simple abstract notion of value, that is in Chapter 1 of Volume 1. This simple notion is complemented by the ideal extroversive form of the value of commodities, that is money, which is discussed in Chapter 3. It is only henceforth that value has been fully constituted. So consequently, abstract labor disappears from Marx's vocabulary. Now, he does that partially because he doesn't want to, particularly in Volume 1, he doesn't want to get you too confused. And he does, it comes back and is better articulated in, subsequent volumes and theories of surplus value and blah, 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 blah. But we know, of course, that the only thing that really got published was Volume 1. So far too many people reduce or overdetermine even our understanding of Marx with that, and don't sort of see how all the other things sort of fit together with that. And we know, of course, that Volume 1 ultimately gets revised and et cetera, it goes through several editions. And betwixt the later period, you have, the things that wind up as Volume 2 and Volume 3 and theories of surplus value. All that happens sort of in between, and for a variety of reasons. And with the Grundrisse, et cetera, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes on. So money establishes the actual commensuration, that is the homogeneity of commodities, that is in combination with a particular standard, that is, currency standard like pounds or dollars. It provides the only one actual ideal measure of value. And Marx indeed stresses that the measure is, quote unquote, ideal. You see, that's the more important part of it, about ideal versus material in that sense of ideal things. That's one way of thinking about it. I mean, the other way, of course, is there's a tremendous literature on money that hitherto didn't get addressed until after World War II. And, there's some really great works, and that's kind of covered in this particular text, a pretty long text edited by Mosley. But that's kind of the important point, is that, you can have currency, but and most calculation is done because money is there and it can be priced, but it has other problems. And I will stop for a moment, just because that's kind of where we're uh, we can come back to this in a moment. And I can't remember whether it's above or below. Yes, here it is. The quantity theory of money. Now, Wikipedia talks about it originating in the 16th century and proclaimed the oldest surviving theory in economics. That is a hypothesis within so-called monetary economics, which states that the general price level of goods and services is directly proportional to the amount of money in circulation, i.e., the money supply, and that the causality runs from money to prices. Now, that seems perfectly logical to us, because it's all measured in what some form of currency, etc. But the reality, of course, and this is why reading David Graeber is so important, is that some of this wealth is not just money; it's debt, right? There's a Graeber, 5,000 years of debt, and Michael Hudson's stuff on money, and this is debt and credit are there in different forms, of course, and measured out in different ways. But wealth is not identical to this. And this is problematic because a lot of people, sort of work with that idea. And going back to 16th century, this is that same thing about Italian banking and, et cetera, et cetera, that, a lot of trade is not done carrying currency around. And it goes all the way back to the beginnings of numbers, that the number itself is a representation. So, you've got to get a better sense of what's going on. So that's why I bring it up, and that everyone has a thing about quantity theories of money. And then, of course, velocity of money comes from making that comparison to physics. And yes, speed is important. And of course, in quantum terms, you have increasingly, quantum levels of speed, which is useful for some things and not useful for others. And that's kind of the interesting way in which we're sort of moving. And it is not always the case that speed is better, like not unlike size. So there's a whole conversation from Wikipedia, discussions of state money and credit theories of money and debt theories of money, and a mention of Graeber, among other things. And so we get back to the Mosley thing. So Mosley says the introversive substance and the extroversive form of value, form versus substance, are inseparable. That is, value cannot be concretely measured without money. I mean, you need something. You need numbers of some kind, right? And that it's that thing that the numbers are the same as the money, but not really, because we have abstract versions of it, right, that are floating around. And as I just mentioned, credit and debt are there to sort of screw with our concept of a quantity of money theory. Anyway, Rutan's interpretation relies on a dialectical, this is important, dialectical interpretation of Marx's frequent use in chapter 3 of the German text of the term Veräußerung, Veräußerung, and other terms with the same root of Außer, Alfer, or Auber, anyway, sorry, and which he translates by extroversive as opposed to the introversive or immanent of chapter 1. Now, you could argue from this that, Marx is just going to a classical political economy thing that ultimately becomes, if you follow that path, to neoclassical. But let's not go there for the moment. In the English text of chapter 3, the continuity of the term disappears due to a variety of substitutes. That's a whole translation problem that we've seen before. So Christopher J. Arthur, who does the selection called Value and Money, a very useful article, presents a value form. And note, this is important. There's a whole bunch of folks who talk about value form stuff. And applying it to money gets a little out of control, but you need to sort of adjust your mind to that value form is a thing that current interpretations of Marx include that may or may not be helpful. in interpretation. But anyway, value form theory of money, which is inspired by Marx's emphasis on the importance of value as a social form, because that's what it means. But it doesn't, but is not necessarily Marxist theory per se. That's kind of the way the argument goes. The value form approach to money holds that money is not a veil of the real material content of economic relations. So that's important. And this veil idea, the money veil, persists. It exists in a whole bunch of different forms. And, Rawls talks about it in terms of justice, but he's still actually pursuing the money thing it has money implications at some moment. Anyway, rather, money is essential to value relations. That's not so controversial. Arthur defines value in the first instance, not the last instance, but the first instance, as the power of exchange, which is, hitherto not controversial. And he argues that only money makes value actual. Now, see, that's where it moves to this kind of determination, or at least a representation. It just makes it easier to talk about, certainly, to talk just about money. And you can, it seems simple, just like modern money theory seems simple. It's not really simple. It does involve the state and a whole bunch of other things, but this is the value question always becomes problematic at this moment. Then the concept of measure of value is investigated, because it's this function of money that most Marxist theorists argue must be a commodity. So this is that commodity moment. That is, something has value, but it has value as a commodity and not as value itself. Let's put it that way. And Marx is, importantly, switches around the emphasis in volume 1 to commodity at the front end, because in some ways it's easier to explain. It is more, quote unquote, total in that sense. So you don't have to explain all this other palaver that I just went through about debt and credit and blah, blah, blah. So Arthur argues to the contrary, that paper money, see, this is where it gets all crazy, right? And paper money goes way back. So, you can't make the kind of pre-modern, modern division that a lot of people would like to do. Argues to the contrary that paper money serves as the actual functions of money, including that of measure of value. Chris Arthur then discusses the magnitude of value and argues that only after commodities have been commensurated by money is there any meaning to a law of value rooted in labor time and appearing as price. So what we see here is a kind of sequence that, commodities must be commensurated by money, and then you talk about laws of value, then you can talk about labor time, labor power, and then you can talk about price. So this is important because it's not always the same. And as I've said before, in my terrible metaphoric way or an analogic way, that what counts is not money itself that you take out of the bank, but it's what happens on your pay stub. There's all this other stuff going around that gets deducted or whatever, and that's where all the monkey business is going on in terms of real value in some ways. It's important. You need to save stuff and blah 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 blah. There's all that other, one ignores it because it's most of it must be going to a good cause. Although, some people build ballrooms out of the stuff that gets pulled out of there. So you got to worry about it a little bit. The money form. This is back to Mosley. The money form as such structures such determinations as socially necessary labor time. We've been there before. Deciding to what degree actual labor times are socially validated, and that you can get that parsed out in all kinds of ways, and it gets problematic, of course, when you have child labor, women's labor, blah blah blah. The concept of price of production is then briefly discussed. Recall, of course, that we have two departments, at least in the Marxian context, a production side and a distribution or consumption side. The concept of price of production is then briefly discussed. Once it is understood that value is necessarily measured in money, then prices of production may be interpreted as more, quote unquote, finished forms of value than the direct prices. See, you've already made a parsed difference between a direct price and a finished form of value, because already you have sort of two things and they're not necessarily identical. So value and price emerge from the systematic interactions of a complex whole rather than being presupposed to its development. So this is actually an important idea. And this goes back to the issue of uh, value coming from exchange. And I would assert that Marx makes that simplification, that is, use value and value, as in big V value, in book one, simply because he wants to make it easier to understand, because people might get totally screwed by the idea that, oh, well, there's one value called use value, and then there's this other value called exchange value, and they're not the same. But yes, they are. I mean, they're part of this larger big V value. And so I think that that's a simplification that's partially translation oriented, but also I think really important to work through the value form argument. But anyway, therefore, the short run is more important than the long run. And in the short run, the direction of causation between money and prices is reverse. Prices depend on money rather than the other way around. And that, makes sort of sense. And even if you're a sort of neoclassical person, you can sort of see why that's of necessity important. Um, and so the basic idea here is commodities enter circulation with prices, and money enters circulation with value. So already you see this dichotomy, right? Prices and value. And there's, I don't want to start on this, but there's a ton of literature trying to work through this problem, because it's part of the transformation problem. It's part of all kinds of stuff. So the quantity theory, on the other hand, this is referred to the quantity theory of money, which we just touched on. The quantity theory, on the other hand, ignores the function of measure of value because it has no theory of value, right? We just saw that there's just simply this proportion, and assumes that commodities enter circulation without prices and money enters circulation without a value, which leads to the erroneous conclusion that the value of money and the sum of prices are determined by the quantity of the money commodity in circulation. And that's an easy mistake to make, but it is in fact a very common one. And some people, when explaining volume one, kind of do that, and you gotta get that worked out. I know it's problematic. I mean, if you're trying to teach it, for example, you would come up against this issue, and you probably spend a class period trying to work through this. But it's really important to get that kind of clear, that it is about sequence, as we just mentioned above, rather than sort of realization, because we're not even at realization at that moment. But anyway, the quantity theory, on the other hand, assumes that money is token money, proportional sort of representation, a form of money which is extinct and irrelevant to capitalism. That's not true. Token money does exist, and we see it, we use it. It's just this whole another thing going on. And yes, you can argue that, crypto, for example, might be a version of that, but that's for another, yammering. Campbell also argues that in the final section of chapter 3 of volume 1 of Capital, Marx posits the idea that capitalist money originates from money's function as a means of payment. That's one thing, of course. And that the laws associated with that particular function as a means of payment are the beginnings of a theory of credit money. Well, you can argue that. That's not such a bad idea, particularly in the pre-modern context. But anyway, according to the new interpretation, new interpretation means something here because it's a reference to Duncan Foley and et cetera, et cetera. The value of money is defined as the aggregate ratio of the total living labor to the total net price, as discussed in chapter 2 of Capital. And the value of money does not change in the transformation of values into prices of production. So you can already see that some simplification has occurred, but you got to remember that there is this, as I mentioned before, a kind of sequential way of thinking about this, because it is a kind of logic problem that you need to sort of get in your head and work it out however you want to work it out. But there are sequences of events that are important to think about in this context. The total price of production of commodities is always identically equal to the total value dash price, the value price of commodity, and that total profit is always equal to total surplus value. Now, that's, is not so controversial for most Marxists, but there is a whole other way or additional ways of thinking about it. Anyway, this is remember, we're talking about Moseley's introduction to Marx's theory of money. These studies present value form interpretations of Marx's theory, according to which abstract labor does not exist as a quantity distinct from prices, and therefore abstract labor cannot determine prices. Remember what I said about sequence. The sequence is, this way in which you can think about what means or determines what. Now, Duncan Foley argues that in Marx's theory, abstract labor and prices emerge jointly in the sphere of circulation when the product is sold. Abstract labor and prices emerge jointly in the sphere of circulation in Department 2 when the product is sold. That's the end of, Department 2. What happens at the end of Department 2? With causation between abstract labor and prices running in both directions. This is that logic thing that Richard Wolff talks about. That this goes. This is a circuit. Remember, this is a circuit thing. Rutten argues that Marx originally posited in Chapter 1 that abstract labor exists as intuitive quantities of labor time, but in Chapter 3, unfortunately, and as a result of a lot of, moving back and forth and editing and stuff that other people have worked on, this simple notion is made more complex and determinate, as complemented by the systemic and determinate existence of money as the quote-unquote extroversive, as opposed to introversive, form of value. Now, as Fred Moseley, think that the textual evidence to support these value form interpretations of Marx's theory of value and prices, and this is important here because this is Moseley's position on it, which is different than people like Heinrich. So there's this other thing going on that you don't need to work out now, but you need to sort of think about, because this is, makes either your job harder or easier in terms of thinking about the abstract nature of, value and price in the context of money and blah, 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 blah. That it's weak and unpersuasive. There may be logical problems with Marx's theory of prices represented by equation 1.1 above, and I don't want to get into that. But I think that the textual evidence to support the standard interpretation is very strong, and much stronger than the evidence for these quote-unquote value form interpretations. So here you already see kind of a revisionist sort of opposition, and actually watching Moseley talked to Heinrich about it. It's kind of interesting because they both respect each other, and that's fine. But you can see that there's a difference at work here in this argument. Sort of further research should obviously continue to debate these important issues, because that's kind of where Moseley leaves it. Then about remaining open questions, varying degrees of certainty, and for different reasons, money does not have to be a commodity in Marx's theory, even in the fundamental function of measure of value, even though Marx himself may have thought that money as measure of value does have to be a commodity. This is the crux of the commodity money sort of organization that some people talk about. I think Harvey talks about it. Pure paper money, not backed by gold, can also function as a measure of value. That's, currently, demand deposits and blah, 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 blah. Similar conclusions have been also reached by Matthews and Williams. Germer is the strongest proponent of the opposing view that money as a measure of value has to be a commodity in Marx's theory. So you can see there's a kind of spectrum of where you want to place meaning. Bellafiore also holds this view, because the measure of value must, sort of ipso facto, must possess value. The measure of value must possess value. And because the regulation of social labor requires that individual labor be converted into social labor by equating its product with another product of labor. That seems fairly obvious to most people. Now, when you get to financialization, that's where it gets all ugly. But that abstract relation is actually fairly important because often it is, sort of misread or misunderstood. But there are, as I would refer in the future to, indexical relations among these things. But anyway, I myself, that is Fred, would argue that Germer's argument that the measure of value must possess value is a historical contingency. That just seems obvious, not a theoretical necessity. So there is that difference. I mean, you can just see within the context, you don't have to be, an annals historian or, Bradell or whatever to think about that. So in order to function as the measure of value, a particular thing must be accepted by commodity owners as the universal equivalent. So, there's sort of proxyism is going on. Until the 1930s, though, in the absence of any state-mandated alternative, commodity owners required that the universal equivalent, hence the measure of value, had to be a commodity, or at least convertible into a commodity at legally defined rates. And that's the fundamentals of labor relations, sort of that's what underlies it. But anyway, however, in the Great Depression, it became impossible to maintain the convertibility of paper money into commodity money. That's exactly the and yes, we have all kinds of explanations for it, but the reality, of course, there 25, 30, 50% of your population is unemployed or can't be paid anyway. And the government tries to fix it by printing money, but as we see in the German hyperinflation, that this is crazy. But government does print money occasionally just to kind of regulate stuff. So, you need to sort of work through that. Governments legalized the inevitable, and commodity owners had no choice but to accept paper money by itself as the universal equivalent. That's kind of what happens, what is it, Nixon or whatever. And hence, as the measure of value, with respect to Germer's second argument, Fred agrees that the regulation of social labor requires that private individual labor must be converted into social labor by being represented in some observable socially acceptable form. Let me break here for a moment and say this is a classic example of why some people become artists working in their garrets. This is a Van Gogh problem, right? You don't sell any artwork, but ultimately your artwork is worth millions, but you're dead. So that this is the necessary social acceptable form of your private labor in that sense. It is the problem of a delusion for a lot of people. So, and it is the problem of genius in that sense as well. However, back to Fred, Fred does not think that this socially acceptable form of appearance of social labor has to be a commodity. Once pure paper money, not backed by a commodity, has been declared by governments as the universal equivalent, then this pure paper money can also function as the form in which social labor is expressed. That is, it can also function as a measure of value. Indeed, in this case, paper money must function as the measure of value, and even though it contains no labor, I mean, it does, because somebody had to engrave the plates and, run the presses and blah, blah, blah. Paper money must function as the measure of value, and even though it contains no labor, because there's no other possible measure of value and no other possible way to represent social labor in an objective form. However, this conclusion raises the important further question, that is, if social labor is represented by paper money, then what determines the quantity of social labor that is represented by a given quantity of paper money, since it's no longer determined by the labor time contained in gold? You see, you already have these these are fundamental issues, right? Backing things with gold, et cetera, et cetera. So, in other words, what determined, and this demonstrates, at least from Marx's point of view, how we tried to work around the problem And decades have been spent on this. In other words, what determines value of money, or the monetary expression of labor time, MELT, when money is no longer a commodity? Now, unfortunately, none of the authors in this book who accept that money as a measure of value does not have to be a commodity has presented an explanation of how the value of money, or MELT, is determined in the case of pure non-commodity money. Foley argues that the MELT can be empirically measured ex post, after the fact, by the aggregate ratio of money value added to living labor. But he acknowledges that this empirical estimate of the MELT does not provide a theoretical explanation of what determines the MELT, which he says is left hanging theoretically. So, this is a kind of fudging the issue. I mean, this is being worked out, of course, that some people, Shake, etc., are trying to work through some of what the implications of this are at a macro level. So this is not like somebody just let it go. So people are still working on this. This empirical estimate of the MELT, that is the value added of living labor, value added / living labor, cannot be used to determine the MELT, because then the MELT would depend on value added and could not be used to determine value added, as contradiction, or the prices of commodities as in equation 1.1 above, because that would be, yes, of course, circular reasoning. Now, let me break here for a second and say, there's a lot of circular reasoning going on in here. The point is, are they perfect or imperfect circles? But anyway, that's another point. Back to the text. Nelson argues that the value of money is determined by the purchasing power of money, i.e., by the inverse of the price level. However, like Foley's empirical estimate, this interpretation of the value of money cannot be integrated into Marx's labor theory of value. This is why the new interpretation is a new interpretation and problematic compared to orthodox sort of looking. So the interpretation of the value of money cannot be integrated to Marx's labor theory of value, in which price depends in part of the value of money, because that would also involve circular reasoning. I myself, that is Fred, suggests that a promising starting point for developing an explanation of the determination of the MELT in the case of pure non-commodity money is Marx's discussion of the determination of MELT in the case of inconvertible paper money discussed above. I present one such possible explanation in Mosley 2004. Fred argues that the determination of the MELT in this case is essentially the same as in the case of inconvertible paper money discussed by Marx, which leads to the surprising conclusion that does not make any difference to one determination of the magnitude of the MELT, whether or not money is assumed to be still based on gold in some way. So that makes, that's sort of a disclaimer in some ways. But anyway, Bellafiore presents a critique of Fred's suggestion. An important disagreement among the authors in this volume is that Foley's and Reuten's chapters present a different interpretation of Marx's theory of money from the standard interpretation presented at the beginning of this introduction, especially with respect to the quantitative determination of price represented by equation 1.1. These studies present value form interpretations of Marx's theory, according to which abstract labor does not exist as a quantity distinct from prices, and therefore abstract labor cannot determine prices. Foley argues that in Marx's theory, abstract labor and prices emerge jointly, as we've said before, in the sphere of circulation when the product is sold, with causation between abstract labor and prices running in both directions. So that's kind of all, as far as I want to go. There's a whole bunch of other discussions, and he works through this because, eventually you have to get to things like international payments and stuff, and that's what gets us to the international settlements thing that I want to talk about. So back to the beginning. The article, a paragraph before the article. The implications of quantum technologies are deeply political. The choices made today about how to fund research, structure international and public-private cooperation, and design guardrails will shape who benefits from quantum advances and who bears the burdens. As such, quantum policy demands a broad, inclusive dialogue that engages lawmakers, civil society, and global stakeholders alongside leading quantum scientists and engineers. Only by acting early can we ensure that the quantum revolution advances human flourishing and democratic governance rather than exacerbating inequality or fueling authoritarian control, which is where we are now. Um, so, this is an article, or actually a text. This is a monograph, a working paper done by the Bureau of International Settlements. Uh, uh, oh no, this is, well, anyway, I included with the BIS stuff an article by Maloney and Al-Khawari about the public policy considerations of quantum computing, and I included, as I am wont to do, tables and charts. Um, so this one explains the difference between sort of wicked policy problems and unstructured policy problems, and this implies, that there is certain other things that quantum stuff kind of can either make more complicated or perhaps make better. So there's that. And also another table which identifies, which I think is important for those doing research on this, particular policy sectors in which a quantum political economy could operate, and that is agriculture, banking, and finance. Uh, we've mentioned this before, right? Healthcare, manufacturing, renewable energy, which is the thing I'm more interested in, supply chain, logistics, sustainability, telecom, and transportation. So quantum computing is seen as a game changer in technology, but it's not just a scientific breakthrough. It has the potential to reshape power structures, amplify inequality, and further solidify monopolies in our global politics, which is kind of what's going on right now. So anyway, the article, or the BIS thing, is the Quantum Computing and the Financial System Opportunities and Risks by Hour DuPont, Gambacorta, Park, Takahashi, and Valco, all of the Bureau of International Settlements, whatever. So this is the abstract, and as we're yammering here, and I may end early just because you're probably already fallen asleep, but quantum computers are still in an experimental phase, but in the future, they may have a profound impact on the financial system. By providing faster and potentially more efficient solutions, quantum computers have the potential to solve certain complex problems that are of paramount interest in the field of economics and finance. Now, quantum stuff can fix all kinds of other stuff too. But for example, quantum simulation algorithms can be leveraged in stress testing and macroeconomic analysis, and quantum optimization can be used in asset pricing. Now, all of these things are the things that have been first tried or used in trying to develop a quantum economics, because that's the easiest way to do it. But as I try to make things harder for myself, I think there are other areas in which stress testing, asset pricing in particular, as you sort of saw what I tried to do before, is also an equally interesting problem that can be solved, or better solved, I think, by quantum tech. Meanwhile, the advent of quantum computers also introduced a potential threat to financial stability, especially through their ability to breach some of the most widely used cryptographic algorithms. Now, this particular piece has about 2/3 of it is about cryptographic, it's about encryption. It's about security threats, which are, as they show, pretty interesting. I mean, it just shows how stuff can happen faster, and things that you thought could be encrypted can be decrypted really quickly. So that's the rest of the article. Read it for yourself. It's really interesting to see different ways in which you talk about how the firewalls get breached, blah blah blah. Despite especially through their ability to breach some of the most widely used cryptographic algorithms. Despite the nascent state of quantum computing development, the potential for sensitive data to be stored now with the intention to be decrypted later necessitates immediate preparation. So this is the question of, what kind of front end encryption do you require? And yes, it identifies, that it's not sloppiness. It's just that people don't think, well, they'll never get past this, size encryption. But quantum algorithms can do that without a lot of trouble, which is sort of interesting also. So this paper explores the transformative potential of quantum mechanics and its applications to the financial system, including the potential benefits as well as the main risks. It also highlights current actions within the central bank community to address these potential risks, including Project LEAP, which is done by the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, Innovation Hub, the Banque de France, and the Deutsche Bundesbank. So needless to say, they're working on this. Now, of course, I include charts, and this is the evolution. And you can see how recent this is, although the idea of it happens, closer to the beginning of last century, but getting it there, Feynman, etc., it only occurs, kind of late, only about, 40 some odd years ago. And then, of course, speed increases, qubit calculation, etc. Now, this potential and rapid development of the field have attracted the attention of all relevant actors, researchers, investors, financial market operators, and policymakers. The increasing interest in the new opportunities provided by quantum computers gives rise to a reciprocal interaction between surging investments by venture capitalists. Note, remember AI, in quantum computing related projects and new discoveries in the field of research. Quantum machines operate on fundamentally different principles and bring new solutions for intractable challenges. Some of the most promising fields include simulations, optimization, and search problems. And you can see how that applies to political economy. You need to model a certain problem. You need to get it to resolve itself to in the case of neoclassical, more linear solution. And of course, just simply the time that it takes to find stuff, which is what AI is about in terms of search problems. Indeed, one of the first application areas will likely be the simulation of quantum mechanical phenomena. That's the physics stuff. In addition, quantum computing has potential applications in many other sectors, such as chemical, biological engineering, and complex manufacturing. This paper examines the impact of quantum computers on the financial system with a focus on potential applications, et cetera, et cetera. They, provide the promise of benefiting the financial system through their ability to implement novel algorithms, which can significantly improve complex pricing and risk evaluation processes. Conversely, as highlighted above, QCs, quantum computers, pose a threat to the security of the financial system by potentially breaking current cryptographic protocols that are securing financial data. The paper highlights both of these aspects and discusses strategies that central banks, because the BIS mainly deals with central banks, and financial intermediaries that can employ to mitigate the threats. So, in the financial sector, which is why I've been talking all this time about financialization from the political economy side, QCs could offer new possibilities by enhancing risk assessment, optimizing portfolio management, improving macro analysis, and many other areas. Combined with artificial intelligence, AI, it may also provide significant value, for example, in fraud detection or trading strategies. It amuses me that you couple fraud detection and trading strategies, because that's kind of the Trump administration. Or maybe just fraud and trading. But anyway, further new applications will continue to emerge. It's evidence, for example, the strong growth of literature on quantum algorithms for financial applications. And, they provide another threat to the system because of encryption, commonly used encryption techniques in digital communication financial systems. Cryptographic schemes are based on mathematical problems which are prohibitively difficult for today's computers to solve, classical computers. However, Some of these problems, not all of these problems, some of these problems will be solvable by future quantum computers, opening the possibility for, yes, malicious actors to hack encryption, which is really the main focus of this particular paper. Without proper action, authentication and encryption methods reliant on current cryptographic techniques will become ineffective, compromising confidentiality and integrity and potentially leading to substantial financial and reputational damages. So let me break here for a second and say, if I were going to sell offshore money laundering services, I would sell the idea, having actually gone through the work or found some, quants to work it out, to protect, your offshore illicit funds with quantum computing, or you could at least claim that you did it and finagle people, which is, part of the whole deal about offshore money. But anyway, the remainder of this paper is structured as follows. Section 2 provides an overview of quantum computing and quantum algorithms. Section 3 delves into the potential applications of quantum computing within the financial sector, including advancements at the confluence of quantum computing and artificial intelligence. In Section 4, we discuss the economic effect of these potential applications. In Section 5, we describe the effects of quantum mechanics on cryptography, including risks and opportunities. Based on this, Section 6 discusses potential impacts on the financial system and possible actions to mitigate risks. And Section 7 summarizes the main conclusion. So I'm not going to read, I haven't included all of this for the obvious reasons, but it does, sort of basic explanation of how we got to quantum computing and the tech, the hardware, uh, uh, and some provisos. Since quantum computers are still in an experimental phase, and that's kind of important, most of this work is currently theoretical. That's the underlying issue, of course. These quantum algorithms are either only described mathematically and not yet implemented, or they are tested in an emulated quantum computer, which does not provide the quantum speed up that future real implementations promise. So, in other words, the emulation thing only, does a limited set of, computations to show that the algorithms are not identical to those used by or compares it to classical computers. So anyway, so let me sort of skip to, as I've already skipped, that there are applications to the financial system, and they did a literature survey and showed how everyone is obsessed with thinking about it, and the area most applied in the financial sector is financial risk, or performing more accurate stress tests in order to improve risk management, which, if you've done a little bit of this, kind of that's a big deal. Another field where the impact of quantum computing may be significant is investments and portfolio management, including financial market risk evaluation. Now, a political economy approach to this would not be to protect capitalists, but rather to reveal capitalist risk takers. And you could sort of see that with certain parties that are manipulating certain wars and manipulating, commodities markets. And lest you think they aren't doing it, you can actually see it, and people talk about it this now. So anyway, more accurate simulations and analysis could improve investment strategies and asset pricing. It is expected that artificial intelligence and machine learning will gain substantial improvement with better fraud detection mechanisms or even better trading strategies. In addition, other areas such as payments and settlement and macro modeling could be positively impacted. In what follows, we will discuss each of these areas in more detail. Now, there's a lot more detail in here, and it shows that good literature sort of as a cross section, so it'd be useful. And then, of course, it introduces this idea from machine learning about deep learning. Deep learning involves training artificial neural networks, and we've heard that before, even in sci-fi, right? Neural nets to analyze data and make decisions. These networks consist of layers, and note my millefeuille, that is my layer cake example, an input layer, one or more hidden layers, and an output layer. Each node acts as a artificial neuron, forming connections with others through assigned weights and thresholds. So, you know, uh, deep learning faces challenges which quantum computing could address, particularly in terms of memory and time efficiency. Quantum deep learning holds promises for enhancing speed and efficiency of training, and advances in neural networks through the use of, yes, this is a big word, quantum gradient descent algorithms. These algorithms aim to expedite training by estimating gradients more efficiently through quantum principles. Though integrating AI with quantum computing presents significant challenges, no shit. Researchers are actively investigating this avenue to potentially augment AI capabilities and also augment AI mistakes. But anyway, um, they could bolster each other's development. While realizing practical applications involves surmounting considerable obstacles such as costs and technical limitations, the potential impact, of the synergy between these two fields warrants attention. So that's kind of one part where it could, on the one hand, be great. On the other hand, make things go out of control faster. Anyway, so the economic effects of quantum computing, from short-term benefits to a new general-purpose technology. So that's the kind of difference, the kind of elite or specific a way in which you can understand it, as in terms of the superiority to classical computing. And that, and the problem is, of course, they don't have a lot of real world examples to show that this is working or not working. So that's kind of, they complain here about, well, we don't have really a lot of cases, there's not a lot of data. So that's kind of, but this could multiply obviously very quickly. In addition to the algorithmic challenge, Biamonte et al. Identified two additional obstacles, that is, data initialization and output measurement. And so there are three steps in which you could describe the quantum computing process. That is, number one, initializing the quantum computer with data encoded quantum states. Remember, we talked about quantum states before, right? Two, performing operations on these configured qubits. And number three, extracting information from the final quantum state. So it's not identical, but it resembles, what you would do with, sort of a classical computing, but it does it, faster and in a different way, which is the most important part of it. Well, most quantum algorithms focus on optimizing step two, that is, operations on the qubits. Steps 1 and 3 can be time consuming, as I just suggested. Initializing large data sets by converting them into quantum states can be inefficient. I mean, it could be, you just, it can be a quantum sized problem. And extracting meaningful information from the final qubit string can also be computationally expensive, potentially overshadowing the speed gains achieved with quantum algorithms. So, there's a limit to this, and it'd be interesting to talk about that limit. It's no different, or actually it is different, but it resembles the problem, of course, in cryptocurrency, right? Where there is a limit. I mean, you may never reach that limit, but there is a limit. Many of the use cases studied in the current literature address problems that are being solved today by classical computers. For such problems, the short-term benefits of quantum computing often come in the form of faster computation with similar results. So, you have to ask, well, are you paying for the computer time? Do you need a quantum computer? Are people going to, collectivize, support of it? Blah, 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 blah. And then issues of that obviously quantum computing can aid high performance computing, but not all. Let me give you a sense of this. Not all high performance computing is benefited by quantum computers so far. So, and then they make this tedious analogy to steam engines and electricity. So let me get to the conclusion, and then I'll stop. Conclusion. This paper discusses the new opportunities and challenges that quantum computers represent for the financial system. This new technology will not replace existing computers. It won't. And it will not be applicable in all areas of computation. But in some selected areas, it has the potential to significantly accelerate calculations. We survey possible application areas in the financial systems, including risk management, investment and portfolio optimization, artificial intelligence, payments and settlement, and macroeconomic modeling. Naturally, most use cases described in the current literature address known computational problems that are being solved today using classical computers. We also discuss the potential economic implications of applying quantum computing in the financial system. We conclude that initial gains are modest. They're hedging their bet here, right? Partly because quantum computers are still at an early stage of development and experiments are performed with small prototypes. Partly because the advantages of quantum computing over classical computers become apparent only in a specific set of computational problems. You waste all your time working on making a good set of computational problems only to realize it probably doesn't do anything. I mean, it could be elegant, but it might not do anything. Uh, while early experimental use cases focus on computational problems successfully addressed today with classical computers, the biggest gains can be expected in future use cases that are unsolvable using classical computers. Now you can sort of see that everyone's going to go out and do the NP problem or whatever with this stuff. These will be identified gradually and mostly when quantum computers are already available. It is possible that we will see only marginal economic gains in the early phases, but a transformational effect in the longer run. So this is kind of, talking about, is it an investment opportunity? We go on to discuss the specific impact that quantum technology has on cryptography. That's what I was mentioning before. Most of this paper is on cryptography and thereby on the stability of the financial system. Current cryptography is based on mathematical problems that are unsolvable using classical computers, but that can be potentially solved by future quantum computers. This means that a future quantum computer can break the encryption schemes protecting our financial system, thereby representing a threat to financial stability. While the benefits of QC will take time to develop, the cybersecurity threat is imminent due to the possibility for malicious actors to intercept and store data today with the intention to decrypt it in the future when QCs become available. We discuss central banks' responsibility in addressing this challenge and the steps that need to be taken to mitigate the risk. Finally, we look at how quantum technology can have a positive impact on security. For example, now this is where this was kind of the hopeful point of it, because it really could be interesting. And this is if you're going to sell your offshore money laundering operation, you could offer this up. Quantum key distribution, a promising technology to distribute secret keys to communicating endpoints, offering a major challenge to IT systems today. So that's kind of, and of course I included a chart that includes all the potential things. And for our political economy project, it has, at least 5 or 6 different areas that can be where this could be applied, primarily in risk, using risk analysis to show how some people were stupid, equally so in investment and portfolio management, not so much in AI and machine learning, other than, trying to get things to go faster or more efficiently, or to solve certain types of problems that are really difficult, just even in the search parameter issue. Because that's kind of my complaint about AI is that, it does quick and dirty kind of okay, but you have to keep asking it questions to get it to figure out kind of stuff that you really want, because it kind of oversimplifies what you need to get. Anyway, payments and settlements, of course, because as I was looking at weeks before, is on the problem of liquidity, which underlies most of these kind of crises anyway. Most of our major problems in the last few economic crises were liquidity problems. So anyway, and then I included another chart, and then some other tedious stuff on collateral multipliers and other kind of funky things that are connected to this, and just because I was screwing around with this. And I included the complete article on radical political economics by Patty Quick. Uh, Essentially what she was doing was presenting a brief overview to a newer journal called the American Review of Political Economy, which sort of augments the review of radical political economy and the Union of Radical Political Economics, which is ERPE. Anyway, so that's it. I've yammered as usual far too long, but I've ended before I normally or unfortunately have entered. So I will let me see if there were any questions or brickbats offered. Oh yeah, Skynet, of course. We always have Skynet. Skynet's very possible. What's worse is humans defending the machine that makes AI decisions, and I've been there. I actually had a little argument with someone on that. Oh, we just have to train the system with your complaints or arguments or whatever, and I'm going, you know what that means, right? So anyway, let's see what else. Data centers important. Yes, there's been some political issues. Needless to say. Um, I'm pretty sure that Crowley, who defeated Hong, is going to say something about data centers. He'd be stupid not to, but okay. I think that does it. Let me go to the system and shut down the live stream. And thank you for your interest and subsequent participation.